Class, Mr. G here. Today we're going over some basic skills. Got a conversation with another art teacher online, and she's like, you should do a video on some of these basic stuff, how to use an X-acto knife, how to use a ruler. That's what we're going to be covering today. So during this time when we're no longer in school and we're having to figure out what do our students need to know, we really rely on other art teachers and other teachers in various fields to bounce ideas off of what do these kids need to know right now. One of those things that I was planning on actually doing this term, who I've had before previously, and they have their family is in construction, and they were like, I don't know how to use a ruler, I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to do that, and they know that I build and make a bunch of stuff myself, so I want to provide that assistance to this kid because of not being in school, don't have that access right now. So this is going out to all my students who do need that help as well, and for those teachers who are like, I need somebody who can do a video on how to use an X-acto knife, how to use a ruler. And so we're going to start a little series. And so throw something down in the comments if you like more of this content, so I know that you guys want to see more of it, and I'll be happy to make some more. Today we're going to deep dive into rulers and X-acto knives and just the little tips that I do with these. Do plan on expanding this out if you guys are down for it. Just let me know down in the comments, and we'll take care of that. Okay, we have simple materials here. We have a pen, a couple pencils, X-acto, rulers. I have a box of blades, which I'll go over these in just a second. All right, starting off with my favorite tool, the X-acto knife. I've been using X-acto blades for years, hence all my pocket knives. And this isn't all of them. This is just what I had in a drawer. So the differences between this blade and this blade are very minimal. This one is kind of a surgical steel, whereas this one is a more pounded, flattened steel. This one has a locking mechanism. This has no locking mechanism. Now, why is that important? Because these are what we use typically in the school classroom, because this is what we're using if we're cutting out different materials to work on sculptures and different things where you're going to use stuff like this. These blades you can change out. I'll show you down here at the hilt. Down here at the base, you will loosen that up to where you can actually pull out the blade. And that you can see this blade is actually pretty worn. I've used it a lot. Now, because we're in quarantine, I don't have access to my blade box at school because I have a number of assortment of these. What I usually like to do is I have a cardboard box that I can pop these into as they get old. That way that I'm not just throwing a bare blade like this in the trash can, could slice up the bag, get tossed out, whatnot, because it is still sharp. The filing of the blade, you can see where the blade has been sharpened along that edge right there, that part of the silver that changes. And I say silver because I'm using it as a color. This part down here stays extremely sharp. The point, the tip here, that gets dull, and you do need to change those out. So I was going to pull out my workshop blade so that you guys could see this at a much easier scale. There we go. Now, these blades are for, these ones are usually for a box cutter, box cutting blades. They do also make a square shaped one that you use for different cutters. These ones are the ones that we usually use for box cutting blades. And I'm holding it because I know what I'm doing. So again, disclaimer down here at the bottom, don't do this without supervision, or if you've never done this before, be cautious. These blades are extremely sharp and they will cut you. Brought over some newspaper just in case. So you can see if we just barely drag that blade along the line, you can see it's starting to cut. Again, I'm not really applying any pressure, lightly using it, but that way you can see it actually cutting. But I did want to show you this because I want to go over how this thing works. What is special about this blade? So all blades have the same principle in effect when you're working with them. Pull out a couple blades here so you can see some variances. All of these blades here basically have the same attributes in that there's a pointy side, there's usually a flat section of the blade, and they all do the same thing. They all can cut, and that is the important thing. So how we know that these things can cut? Well, all blades work off of a basic principle. They work off of a slice. These all have fine tips that can pierce and puncture. However, all actions of the blade really deal with those two principles, where you can pierce an object, such as this, by pressing into the object and you'll pierce through it. But a pencil can do the exact same thing, where we can use it as a punch to pierce through an object. It's just a little more cumbersome. With a blade, we can slice and puncture at the same time. So the action of the blade, again, don't try this. Use this video to show, don't do it yourself. This blade works on the act of slicing. If I actually push the blade across my hand, it will slice, it will cut me. However, if I take the blade and just press into my skin, it will not cut me, because the body of the blade doesn't break the surface tension. So you can see as I'm holding into my hand and pressing in, it doesn't cut, it doesn't even leave a mark. And it's all because of how the blade is being used. And this is like an old grandma trick. That's why. And grandma would use a knife, paring blade such as like this, or a knife like this. And she would take the vegetables to peel them, and she would cut them just like this in her hand. And she would never cut herself, because the blade doesn't cut on the push. It always cuts on the pull. So she would cut veg and stuff like that in her hand, just like this, and it'd be just fine. She would do the same thing with a pocket knife if we were out in the woods. I had a very rustic grandmother. And all she's doing is just holding it and slicing it into her hand like so, and it cuts just fine. All blades cut the same way. I'm just gonna lay this down here and press through so you can see it chopping just like that. So we go through how these things cut, what grandma showed us, to get to a very simple point that I do in class. Now, I do this in class all the time, and teachers, I do this as a point of making things a lot easier for me. That's the reason I'm showing this trick. However, students, do not do this. I am giving this as an instructor point of view. Do not do this just for simplicity, just for safety's sake. I'm telling you not to do this. Instructors, you be the best judgment. So I'm going to reinsert my blade into my X-acto. And the reason I do this is because this is the best way to sharpen pencils from a drawing perspective. And I'll tell you why in just a second. So let me take my newspaper and lay it down so I got a nice even surface here. Now, placing the blade, I'm putting the blade parallel with the pencil. Let's zoom out so you guys can see. I know the blade here, as we see it, we can't see the blade. The blade is so thin. But I'm putting it parallel with the pencil, and as I'm going down to cut, I'm lifting it up just a little bit. So if you did this as a off of a protractor, I'm only lifting it up about 10 degrees. So very minimal rising here. The reason that I sharpen all my pencils like this is because where I teach, we have a lot of rules when it comes to testing. Students can't get up, teachers have to walk around, monitor progress, make sure that students are always working and that there is no questions and that everybody can do their stuff very easily. So I'll walk around during testing to sharpen pencils. So A, the student always has a pencil that's sharp, and B, no one has to get up and no one disturbs anything. And the students know that I have this blade on me so that I can sharpen their pencil. And I'll even stand in the hallway and sharpen pencils as kids are walking past, because then they see me engaging with students, and students always come to me for help. It's a very positive atmosphere for when I do that. So blade is always sheathed when I'm not using it, by the way. My blades, when I have them, are always closed, and you can see that I'm employing a locking mechanism on all these blades, because the locking mechanism for me is an imperative thing. If it doesn't have one, I don't like that kind of a blade, unless it's in the kitchen. So sharpening the pencil works like this better because a couple things. Number one, when you're using a blade to sharpen the pencil, you have not ground around the graphite that's inside of here. When you use a pencil sharpener, it grinds the wood around the pencil to shave it at a elongated angle. The blade cuts across. If you actually look at a pencil sharpener. All right, so I started editing this, and we're gonna break it up into two parts. The knife thing is kind of more important than the rulers, so I'll do the rulers next week. This week is just gonna be the blades. All right, so let's get back to it. So we take our pencil sharpener. All right, so we have a really dirty pencil sharpener here. Inside of here you have a blade, and the blade that you have in there is exactly the same as one of these blades. Focus. That blade and this blade are just alike in the way that they are cut and designed. The shape on this is a triangle, this is a square. That's the only difference, really. When you put this pencil into this sharpener, the blade cuts the material at an angle like this. So it's actually cutting the wood and the graphite at the same time. With an X-acto blade, I'm cutting down and across, just putting less pressure on the graphite and the wood, or the if it's a color pencil, wax inside of it. That has a big difference into how these things last longevity wise. When I'm cutting it at a side angle like this, the pressure will actually go against the grain of the graphite and crack it. That's why when you're going with the pencil sharpener, all of a sudden you can pull the graphite out, you can pull out the wax, whatever. It's because the way that it's been cut, this has been broken on the inside of the shaft. Whereas with the cut with the blade is removing it in spaces and cutting across it, which is not causing it to chip and fall off during the drawing process. Also, doing it from this angle, I can take one side of the blade or take one side of the pencil and just trim on it for a minute and just erase a lot of that graphite and get to a nice flattened side. This flattened side is easier to draw larger spaces with, and then a nice chiseled edge gives those nice fine lines that we're always looking for. So that when we're working with it, we can work in multiple sections by working with that nice fine tip, or we can turn it to the side to get a much more broad shading pattern. So again, nice fine lines on one side, shading pattern with another. Just a nice way to use the X-acto blade, okay? Now continue on, we're gonna talk about cutting. How do we actually cut out objects with an X-acto blade? Now, when I'm holding the blade, as I tell my students, one, make sure the blade is tight inside of the X-acto knife. So if the blade is nice and tight, so it can't be pulled out, there's no wiggle room, this stuff is gonna be a lot safer for one. Number two, when you're cutting, the wrist action that you're using to cut, the way that we're holding this like a pencil usually. When you bend your wrist will never come closer to your body than it is right now. So I always tell my students actually cut towards themselves because their wrist is gonna stop that motion, okay? Always do short cuts, never do long cuts. The left hand, because I'm a right-handed person, goes in front of me to hold the paper down, so that the back of the blade is always pointed towards the skin so that it can never touch and it can never cut me, because the back of the blade is this thick, blunt piece of metal. It's not gonna cut me. So thumb and hand is in front, blade is closer to, is the in-between mark, and I'm always cutting on top of another surface. Press in with the blade to actually pierce the paper, and then through the slicing motion is when you will produce the cut. And when you make your cuts in a way to where you're drawing across the surface. So small intentional shapes that you're cutting out. Notice how as I'm moving across the paper, I'm doing simple slices. I'm not going over what I need to cut. I don't need to exert a lot of pressure. If you need to do multiple passes. So I'm going to stop once I come to the edge of this brown on the side over here, bring it down to the side, and then I'm going to go up to here to go across, and we're going to just remove this one sample section. So pulling down in a slicing pattern, just like that, to cut out my piece. Again, don't overexert your blade. Your blade's gonna cut for you. It's gonna do all the work for you. I'll show you with this because it's easier to see. Notice how I'm holding the back of the blade Again, this is not recommended for student usage. This is really for teachers so that you guys can see the blade usage, how I'm bending and twisting the blade. So we're gonna come across, we're gonna cut out this one section with this blade, placing the corner in, piercing a little bit, pressing down just enough to cut through the paper, and then slowly dragging it back. I'm keeping the other paper held, other side of the paper, so it's nice and taut. So as I come across, I get a nice even line. Coming over to the other side, pull down, get to the slight bend. I'm going to turn the paper, not the blade, because I'll get easier action. It's easier to let the paper cut itself across the blade instead of you having to do some of that. So notice how I'm pressing a little more as I work it around. Nice and easy cuts. And then you can do what we do when we're cutting wrapping paper and you get that glide effect. If I press in and I start to pull, the paper then will catch, and I can actually, instead of pulling the blade, pull the paper. My paper is moving, the blade is not right now. That way I get a nice even cut, and I can use the twist of the blade to get just a little bit more refined on that edge. So as it's going down, just going to pull these pieces of paper apart. Nicely cut out, nicely done around the lines to get our nice fine edge. All right, so again, when you're using a blade, you're using it to slice. You're using the tip to puncture, the blade is to slice. So as you're cutting things across, you're going to pierce the object with the point to get a catch. And then as it pulls in the slicing motion, that's when it's going to do the cutting part. Make sure that you guys are always keeping the blades in a safe location. Do not mishandle the blades. As I showed you, went over in the processes so that there's a way to handle the blades correctly. Always make sure that these things are being safe. And if you have like a sheath, such as the cap, once you're done with using the X-acto knife, the cap goes on so that it's handed nicely back to the instructor. Again, make sure this part is tight, the cap is on, the blade is inside of it, and everything is good to go for safety's sake. Okay, class, I hope you guys got something wonderful out of today's class. As always, let's go ahead and take care of our homework, which is to like, subscribe, share on all the various platforms. Don't forget to get our message out there. I want to try and help as many students as possibly can. Don't forget, if you have any question, comment, or concern, raise your hand down in the comments below. Happy to answer those questions from my students. And as always, I will see you guys next class. Until then, later, guys. So I'm trying to figure out how long I can get this beard. I've already trimmed it once. I want to see how far I can go. Ugh. Just in case, during this whole outbreak, if there's a Squatch sighting, it's probably just me.